Good morning, everyone. The theologian and civil rights leader, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., more than once quoted the Unitarian Universalist minister, American transcendentalist and abolitionist Theodore Parker. Born in 1810, our opening words are from the third sermon in his collection of 10 sermons of religion titled Of Justice and the Conscience, published in 1853. Look at the facts of the world. You see a continual and progressive triumph of the right. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. But from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice.
Welcome. At HUUC, we have a profound belief in the interconnectedness with each other and with creation. Whether you've been with us for a long time or this is your first visit, whether you're with us virtually or here in person, we're glad you're here.
The responsive reading is from a poem called Violence by Daniel Hoffman, the 22nd Poet Laureate, consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress from 1973 to 1974. We'll read from this side to that side, and I'll start. After I'd read my poem about a brawl between two sidewalk hustlers, one, insulted, throws the other down and nearly kills him. Over coffee and cookies, a grave senior citizen reproved me.
How could you see such violence and you didn't try to stop them?
Oh, I explained. It wasn't like that, really. I saw two guys in a shoving match and thought I'd write about aggression, what anger really feels like.
Yes, and if one got killed, it would be on your head. You should have stopped them, he said.
I wanted to start with that poem today, not to judge anyone, but to remind myself. I'm really honored to have Marcia as my worship assistant today. She likes to educate people about famous UUs, but I keep trying to tell her she's kind of a little bit of a famous UU. The debate about the most appropriate and effective tactics to use in resistance movements predates any of us here, even Marcia. As a child of the 80s, I was introduced to this debate through the 1989 film Do the Right Thing, which I watched repeatedly one summer in high school at the home of my dear friend and mentor, the Reverend Terry Troya, while volunteering at Project Hospitality on Staten Island. If you haven't seen it, the film follows the inhabitants of a close-knit Brooklyn neighborhood during a sweltering heat wave, chronicling the racial and ethnic tensions that erupt in a riot that results in the destruction of a beloved pizzeria and doesn't solve a darn thing. In this Spike Lee film, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X represent the tension between nonviolence and the need for self-defense. Years later, as Marcia described in her introduction, I was trained by the War Resisters League in nonviolent direct action. I had been marching and protesting against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. As a 9/11 survivor, a sign I saw at a protest summed up my sentiment exactly. War is 9/11 every day. And I was ready to do anything I could to prevent other people from suffering as I had. I read the translations of bin Laden's speeches, and while I did oppose his tactics, I understood the reasons why. He was very clear about what these were. The sanctions against Iraq resulting in 500,000 deaths, the majority of whom were women and children. U.S. support of Israel, which continues to this day, and U.S. policy and presence in the Middle East more generally. His complaints sound really familiar. This was 20 years ago. When Trump ran for office the first time, I heard people that otherwise considered themselves too radical to vote toy with the idea of voting for him to hasten the revolution. And now in his second term, I've heard even more calls for civil war. Of course, I looked to social science to find out if anyone had taken the time to measure this phenomenon so I could understand it better. A group of researchers at UC Davis have been conducting annual surveys about perceptions and attitudes to political violence in the United States since 2022. In an article published in the journal Injury Epidemiology, of course it was my public health people, in 2024, they found patterns in who believes civil war is necessary and who is willing to participate. Approximately 1 respondent in 20 agreed strongly or very strongly that in the next few years, there will be a civil war in the United States. About 1 in 25 also agreed strongly or very strongly that the United States needs a civil war to set things right. But this increased to nearly 40% among those who strongly or very strongly agreed that civil war was coming. So the more you think it's coming, the more you're more likely you are to believe that it's needed. Expectation of and perceived need for civil war were higher among these subsets of respondents. Those more willing than others to commit political violence, including MAGA Republicans, persons in strong agreement with racist beliefs or statements of the potential need for violence to affect social change, persons who strongly approved of or specified extreme right-wing political organizations and movements, firearm owners who purchased firearms in 2020 or later, and those who carried firearms in public all or nearly all the time. These findings were from their second wave of research conducted in May and June of 2023. In May and June of 2024, the same researchers conducted a third wave of surveys. In July of 2025, they published another article in the same journal sharing their findings that while only a small minority of people, 3.7%, thought they would be likely to fight in a future civil war, 44.5% of that minority reported that they would convert to not likely if this were urged by family members. It's unbelievable. 23 to 31% were open to persuasion by friends, respected religious leaders, elected officials, and the media. We do have power. As a US-born, non-Christian white woman, I may not have any business reflecting on the teachings of a Black minister and civil rights leader. Imagining what someone who's no longer with us, who lived in a different era, would have said about current events can only be speculation. Watching news coverage and eyewitness accounts from Minneapolis might make the topic seem trite and dated, or more relevant than ever. Regardless of whether I'm qualified to do justice to the topic of justice, I am called by my faith to do so. Every year, and sometimes in between, I reflect on King's principles of nonviolence. And today, I'd like to bring your attention to the third principle, that nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice or evil, not people. To do this, adherents to nonviolence must recognize that evildoers are also victims and are not evil people. Leading the nonviolent resistor to seek to defeat evil, not persons victimized by evil. Likewise, the first principle of the Unitarian Universalist faith is the inherent dignity and worth of every person. Reverend Wooden last week, as well as our opening words, highlight how King's teachings were profoundly influenced by Unitarian Universalist theology. Not surprisingly, both Dr. King and the UU religion both stand firmly in opposition to the death penalty, which King believed to be not just a contradiction to nonviolence, but a form of racial injustice as well. I have not only always considered myself to be against the death penalty, but to be a prison abolitionist, at least in theory. I mean, how likely is it that my country, the prison capital of the world, will ever completely rid themselves of a practice that is so entrenched, so profitable, and such a powerful tool of white supremacy? However, as those who have actually spent time in prison have tried to warn me, there are some people who maybe really do belong there. And as I've come face to face with people who threaten to harm my safety and potentially the safety of everyone they come into contact with, I can't help but wonder if they're right. People who, despite the efforts of many well-meaning people who try to help them, just cannot be rehabilitated. Even my opposition to the death penalty is subject to cracks, like it was after watching the trial of Gabriel Fernandez. The 2020 Netflix true crime documentary follows the abuse leading up to the murder of an 8-year-old boy in Palmdale, California. The trial stands out because of the charges made against the social workers who failed to protect him, and the implications for that profession had they been found guilty. I'm not going to go into the awful details of the crime itself, but suffice it to say that by the end of the trial, the idea of sitting on a jury to decide whether or not someone should face the death penalty for murder, something that would have previously been unthinkable for me, now seemed like an easy and obvious choice. In the case of Gabriel Fernandez's killers, there was only one victim. But there also exists in this world evil in the form of humans whose disregard for the lives of others, combined with the power to destroy, is so great that a single act of violence against them would end their reign of terror and protect innocent people. Reading Emma Goldman's autobiography, I learned the French word for politically motivated assassination attempt, an attentat. While the inherent dignity and worth of every person sounds like a nice ideal, it's a lofty one. To be successful, nonviolent action relies on the empathy of the observer. This is described in the fourth principle. Nonviolence holds that unearned, voluntary suffering for a just cause can educate and transform people and societies. But I don't have to tell you that some victims are easier to empathize with than others. Take, for example, Brian Thompson, former CEO of United Health, allegedly shot by Luigi Mangione. Health insurance executives felt empathy with the victim and condemned his alleged killer, but I did not. On the other hand, when Renee Macklin Good was shot at the hands of an ICE agent, millions of people reacted in outrage. According to her widow, Becca Good, she literally sparkled. I mean, she didn't wear glitter, but I swear she had sparkles coming out of her pores all the time. When unearned voluntary suffering occurs in the name of nonviolent resistance, empathetic victims are key. When I taught anger management for the county, I knew that anger can be a powerful catalyst for change. I used the 198 forms of nonviolent action from Gene Sharp's 3-volume work, The Politics of Nonviolent Action, to provide inspiration. Unlike King, Sharp was a pragmatic political strategist, not a religious or moral leader. I remember reading in his second volume that there may be instances in which nonviolent action can be combined with other tactics to increase success, but he believed through his research that nonviolence increased the odds of success. And I've made some copies of those, and they're out, but you could also Google them. They're available online. And looking over it, I can see that they could be updated. You know, there's nothing there about cyber activism, for example, which is very powerful. For me, nonviolence is a personal choice. I understand why people commit attentates, and I will not always be able to bring myself to condemn them, but I do not want civil war, and I will actively plead for alternatives to the escalation of aggression. My reasons are partly selfish. King taught that hatred harms the soul of the evildoer, and I want my soul to remain intact. My reasons are also pragmatic. The oppressor will always have more and stronger weapons. I want to act strategically and thoughtfully to increase the likelihood that justice will prevail, and not act aggressively in the moment out of impulse and anger. This past holiday season, I made the odd decision to go down the Epstein-Maxwell rabbit hole. Like a lot of folks in West Michigan, the release of the files showed that their evil acts occurred in our own backyard, and that chilled me to the bone. At the end of Virginia Giuffre's memoir, Nobody's Girl, she writes not of her desire to cause harm to her surviving abuser, who I've heard resides comfortably in prison, but to work relentlessly for policy change that would impact other victims of human trafficking, like removing statutes of limitations. Again, working to fight oppressive systems, not people. I still struggle to see the humanity in people like Epstein and Maxwell. But last year, I did read a book that helped a little. Determined by neuroscientist and primatologist Robert Sapolsky makes a compelling argument that free will does not exist because all human actions have biological, environmental, and historical antecedents. He does recognize that this unpopular stance is difficult for the human brain to grasp, made even harder by our unwillingness to accept that we cannot take credit for our own accomplishments. But the implications for criminology are profound. Reading Determined made me a little more forgiving and brought me a little closer to the ideals of King's third principle, and you use first. So today I stand before you and once again affirm my commitment to nonviolence and consistent with our fourth UU principle, which respects and affirms a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. I'm not going to tell you what to think, but I do encourage you over the next week or so to take time to look up and read through King's 6 principles and reflect on what they mean to you. And let your conscience lead you to commit to a path that reflects your unique experiences as you determine how to utilize your unique gifts. There's so much that needs to be done, not just in terms of action, but there's a lot of spiritual work we're going to have to do that's going to hold us together as individuals and as a community. I don't care if you feel that you're not enough in this moment. I reassure all of you that you are. And as we surf on the long arc of the universe toward justice, I see the sparkles emanating from your pores. In fact, they light my way.
Thank you, Faith. And thank you to the entire worship team. Violence as a way of achieving racial justice is both impractical and immoral. It is impractical because it is a descending spiral ending in destruction for all. The old law of an eye for an eye leaves everybody blind. It is immoral because it seeks to humiliate the opponent rather than win his understanding. It seeks to annihilate rather than convert. Violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. It leaves society in monologue rather than dialogue. Violence ends in destroying itself. It creates bitterness in the survivors and brutality in the destroyers. Martin Luther King.
I think that there are plenty of good people in America, but there are also plenty of bad people in America. And the bad ones who seem to have all the power and be in these positions to block things that you and I need. Because this is the situation, you and I have to preserve the right to do what is necessary to bring an end to that situation. And it doesn't mean that I advocate violence, but at the same time, I'm not against using violence in self-defense. I don't even call it violence when it's self-defense. I call it intelligence. Malcolm X.